Hello, I'm Michael Scott, talking to you from Oxford in the UK. Welcome to the start of a new semester in Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference, where we are bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary cultural debates. Today, I'm absolutely delighted that our guest speaker is Dr. Tom Banchoff from Georgetown. Tom has sponsored and supported this series and other series and conferences with me for the last 8 years. And I've got him to talk. So I'm looking forward to his talk today. He is the Vice President for Global Engagement at Georgetown University. He also serves as professor in the Department of Government and the School of Foreign Service and as director of Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, which he actually founded in 2006. His scholarship centers on religious and ethical issues in world politics, and he has written many books. His essays have appeared in Commonweal, The Tablet, The Washington Post, and other outlets. Tom received his BA from Yale in 1986, summa cum laude, MA from the University of Bonn in 1988, and his PhD in politics from Princeton in 1993. He's held fellowships at Harvard Center for European Studies and at the University of Bonn, and was awarded the DAAD Award for Distinguished Scholarship in German Studies in 2003. If any questions occur to you during this talk, and I hope they will, please type them in using the Q&A button, not the chat button, at the bottom of your computer. Note, towards the end of the event, I will ask as many questions as possible that you've sent in to us for our guests to answer. Please don't leave your questions to the last minute, as we may run out of time. With that, over to you, Tom.
Thanks so much, Mike. It's great to be here with you and to have this opportunity to discuss Pope Francis's wonderful encyclical Fratelli Tutti on its 5th anniversary. Fratelli Tutti, a phrase of St. Francis of Assisi, the Pope's namesake, that we can translate as brothers and sisters all. At the outset, I want to thank you for your leadership of this exceptional series of talks on cultural encounters, books that have made a difference, and encourage all the viewers out there to explore the other talks on offer on YouTube and live in the coming months. And of course, I want to thank you all for participating in this webinar and for being with us for today's conversation. I think it's worth mentioning that the encyclical, with its prominent theme of the culture of encounter, something I'm going to come back to, was one of the inspirations for this series on cultural encounters. That's another good reason for this discussion. Now, the subtitle of your series is Books That Have Made a Difference. Is Fratelli Tutti a book? Can an encyclical, an official papal document, really qualify? To answer that question, I went to Amazon and found a handsome edition, 160 pages long, admittedly big print, but 8 extensive chapters nicely bound. So yes, a book, but also a very long document. An encyclical is an official papal letter for wide circulation that you can also find free on the Vatican website. So Fratelli Tutti qualifies as a book. But is it one that has made a difference? Well, of course, but how much of one really? I want to argue that its impact has been limited so far, but that impact can and should grow into the future. Fratelli Tutti has much to teach us in its sharp diagnosis of a world in crisis, a world that Francis saw so clearly 5 years ago. But also, I think, in its prescriptions. For as we will see, the encyclical's call for human fraternity through friendship and encounter is not simply a high-level exhortation to improve our ethical conduct. It's a concrete and demanding way of proceeding that represents an original contribution to the development of Catholic social teaching and practice for a broken world. All right, to start, let's go back to October 2020, 5 years ago exactly, when Fratelli Tutti was published. It was the heart of the pandemic. We were all very preoccupied. You may not even remember its release. Fratelli Tutti enjoyed nothing like the media echo and widespread acclaim that had greeted Francis's previous encyclical Laudato Si 5 years earlier. There, Francis's resounding call for us to protect our common home resonated deeply back in 2015, the same year that world leaders gathered in Paris to address the global climate crisis. 5 years later, in 2020, when Fratelli Tutti was published, a pandemic was raging, social inequality was continuing to rise, refugee and migrant flows were swelling, and the Middle East and the other parts of the world were racked by war. And this is when Francis comes out with an encyclical with a subtitle on fraternity and social friendship. Should we really be surprised that the public echo was so modest? And a skeptic might ask, if Fratelli Tutti had little relevance then, why should we pay attention 5 years later? Things have only gotten worse. We got through the pandemic, yes, but it's left its scars on our individual and collective lives. Inequality continues to rise. Democracy's in crisis. The migration crisis has deepened, and war and violence has spread in Ukraine, Gaza, and beyond. Why should we even give a thought to human fraternity? It seems more remote than ever. To that skeptic, we might answer with Francis that the worse things get, the more hopeful we should be, or try to be. For Francis, whose Christian faith animated everything he did and wrote, that hope was grounded always in the proclamation of the gospel, the good news of God's saving love for us in Jesus Christ. He saw God was in charge and believed we had nothing to fear. And Francis also insisted that God's love and grace were present in other traditions too, both religious and secular. As he put it in a remarkable passage in Fratelli Tutti, Christians draw their inspiration from a relationship with Jesus, while, quote, others drink from other sources, unquote. He formulated his hopeful message in Fratelli Tutti not as an edict from on high, but as a communication from one human being to others. He put it this way, quote, although I have written it from the Christian conviction that inspires and sustains me, I have sought to make this reflection an invitation to dialogue among all people of goodwill. Now I'm going to return, of course, to the theme of hope and where we go from here, but I want to start where Francis starts. The title of his first chapter says it all: Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. There's really nothing like it in any other papal encyclical in terms of a dire, almost apocalyptic tone. So here I'm really going to let the text speak for itself. Francis writes, and remember, the text was published just 5 years ago, not yesterday, quote, ancient conflicts, thought long buried, are breaking out anew, while instances of a myopic, extremist, resentful, and aggressive nationalism are on the rise. In some countries, a concept of popular and national unity is creating new forms of selfishness and a loss of the social sense under the guise of defending national interests. Now, there's so much to quote from in this encyclical on the international scene, on war, climate crisis, the abuse of human rights, the plight of migrants, unjust and oppressive forms of globalization, and the need for stronger, more representative international institutions. But let me cite some of the passages that I think presciently get at the root of our social and political crises, the hatred and cruelty that are distorting and dissolving our social bonds and increasingly dividing us from one another, from the national to the international, and indeed even on the local level. The best way to dominate and gain control over people is to spread despair and discouragement, Francis wrote. Today, in many countries, hyperbole, extremism, and polarization have become political tools. Employing a strategy of ridicule, suspicion, and the relentless criticism, one denies the right of others to exist or to have an opinion. So here Francis sees a direct attack on human dignity. Another quote, political life no longer has to do with healthy debates about long-term plans to improve people's lives and to advance the common good, but only with slick marketing techniques primarily aimed at discrediting others. In this craven exchange of charges and countercharges, debate degenerates into a permanent state of disagreement and confrontation. So here Francis sees the idea of the common good itself as under siege. A lot of this may sound familiar. What's at the bottom of it? Well, I think one of Francis's section subheadings sums things up well. Shameless aggression. In that section we read, even as individuals maintain their comfortable consumerist isolation, they choose a form of bonding that encourages remarkable hostility, insults, abuse, defamation, and verbal violence destructive of others. And this with a lack of restraint that could not exist in physical contact without tearing us all apart. Social aggression has found unparalleled room for expansion through computers and mobile devices. He continues, this has now given free rein to ideologies, things that until a few years ago could not be said by anyone without risking the loss of universal respect, can now be said with impunity and in the crudest of terms, even by some political figures. Again, this was 5 years ago. One final quote that sums up Francis's argument. In today's world, the sense of belonging to a single human family is fading, and the dream of working together for justice and peace seems an outdated utopia. What reigns instead is a cool, comfortable, and globalized indifference. Now, maybe you're curious, like I am, as to whether there are any parallels to this deeply pessimistic rhetoric in previous papal teachings. I've not found many. In the decades following the French Revolution, when the rise of liberalism, socialism, and nationalism threatened the independence and integrity of the Church, popes were understandably apocalyptic in their rhetoric. But when Pope Leo XIII, the originator of modern Catholic social teaching with his 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum on new things, when he looked around the world, he struck a different tone. He emphasized the dynamism of the Industrial Revolution. He was critical, of course, of the immiseration of the poor, of threats to their dignity, but also confident that church, state, industry, and labor could overcome class conflict and work together to advance the common good. The next great social encyclical, published in 1931, at the heart of the Depression, was Pius XI's Quadragesima Anno, that's Latin for 40 years, a reference to the 4 decades since Leo's encyclical. The Depression is raging, extremism was on the rise, political order was teetering in Europe. But Pius's critique of the world around him was not a radical one. He did warn against rising social inequality, nationalism, and the threat of war, but he also expressed some optimism that the common good and a just society might be reestablished or rebalanced through cooperation between church, state, and social partners. The subtitle of his encyclical makes this clear. It reads, On Reconstruction of the Social Order. Francis's tone is different. Like his predecessors, he carried forward the twin anchors of Catholic social teaching, human dignity and the common good. But in Fratelli Tutti, he views them as fundamentally threatened in ways his previous popes did not. Whereas Leo XIII, Pius XI, and other popes up through John Paul II and Benedict XVI critique the social order for failing to protect and advance human dignity and the common good, Francis and Fratelli Tutti saw both principles endangered at their core. Sees both principles today endangered at their core. As we've seen, he saw human dignity threatened by the ridicule, suspicion, and relentless criticism that denies the right of others to exist or to have an opinion. And political life, he feared, was no longer concerned with advancing the common good, but only with slick marketing techniques primarily aimed at discrediting others. Behind these threats to human dignity and the common good, Francis saw what he called the technocratic paradigm, the worship of power and technology, and the enthronement of egoism and cruelty at the heart of modern political culture. Francis liked to call this dark turn not just an epoch of change, but a change of epic, one that sets our world and its problems apart from all that came before. Now it's here, when his analysis has reached its darkest point, that Francis articulates his understanding of hope. I think it's worth quoting at length, especially as it brings us back to the depths of the pandemic, something we've all, for the most part, I think on this webinar, lived through and have moved on from, perhaps not absorbing not all of its lessons. Despite these dark clouds, which may not be ignored, Francis writes, I would like in the following pages to take up and discuss many new paths of hope, for God continues to sow abundant seeds of goodness in our human family. The recent pandemic enabled us to recognize and appreciate once more all those around us who, in the midst of fear, responded by putting their lives on the line. We began to realize that our lives are interwoven with and sustained by ordinary people valiantly shaping the decisive events of our shared history. Doctors, nurses, men and women working to provide essential services in public safety, volunteers, priests, and religious. They understood that no one is saved alone, unquote. And Francis ended this chapter on dark clouds with the words, hope is bold. It can look beyond personal convenience, the petty securities and compensations which limit our horizon. And it can open us up to grand ideals that make life more beautiful and worthwhile. Let us continue then, he concludes, to advance along the paths of hope. So what exactly do those paths look like? If Francis's critique of the state of the world is radical, so too is his prescription. The balance in the encyclical is not, as one might expect, if you know this genre, a discussion of the core principles of Catholic social teaching and how to apply them, in addition to human dignity and the common good, principles including solidarity, subsidiarity, and the preferential option for the poor. Francis does refer to these and other well-established principles, but they're not really his focus. Instead, he takes us back to the foundation, back to the gospel, devoting a full chapter to the parable of the Good Samaritan. You won't find anything like this in any other papal encyclical. Now, we all know, I think, the parable of the Good Samaritan taken from the 10th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. A man robbed and beaten on the side of the road. Two of his countrymen pass and do nothing, and a stranger from Samaria takes pity on him and helps him. For Francis, the parable is more than a general injunction to treat everyone with kindness. It's a challenge to all of us today, at this moment in history, to break out of our isolation, to move beyond our divisions, and to put love of God and love of neighbor into action. Love does not care if a brother or sister in need comes from one place or another, Francis writes. Love shatters the chains that keep us isolated and separate. In their place, it builds bridges. Now, for Francis, the challenge is to put love into action, and it's not just a personal one directed at Christians or people of goodwill. It also has a collective political dimension. As he puts it, the decision to include or exclude those lying wounded along the roadside can serve as a criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project. He goes deeper here. It's really a beautiful, very extensive exegesis, taking us through the characters in the story. The thieves, who are they? We know them well, Francis writes. We have seen descending on our world the dark shadows of neglect and violence in the service of petty interests of power, gain, and division. What about the victims? For Francis, they are all around us, including the poor, the sick, the used, the unhoused, the abused migrants and refugees, victims of what he calls, in one of his most memorable phrases, our throwaway culture. Domestic and international disputes and the robbing of opportunities, Francis writes, are leaving great numbers of the marginalized stranded on the roadside. And then there are the passers-by, and maybe you know where this is going. There are many ways to pass by at a safe distance, Francis reminds us. We can retreat inwards, ignore others, or be indifferent to their plight. Now, the passers-by among us might take comfort in the fact that we're not thieves, but it's more complicated than that for Francis. Thieves, he points out, usually find secret allies in those who pass by and look the other way. He continues, there's a certain interplay between those who manipulate and cheat society and those who, while claiming to be detached and impartial critics, live off that system and its benefits. I think we should take that to heart. Francis's creative use of imagination, putting us in the story, one of the core methods, by the way, of Jesuit spirituality, and Francis was, of course, a Jesuit. His use of imagination is intended to touch our hearts, to lead us to conversion, to turn our lives around, to put love and service at their core. The encyclical, it turns out, is directed not only or even primarily at those in positions of authority. It's not directed safely at someone else, some anonymous reader somewhere else out there. Inspired by the story of the Good Samaritan, we, all of us, whatever our backgrounds, we are called to do our part to heal a broken world. Let us take an active part in renewing and supporting our troubled societies, Francis writes. Today we have a great opportunity to express our innate sense of fraternity, to be good Samaritans who bear the pain of other people's troubles rather than fomenting greater hatred and resentment. The call is not just to us as individuals, but to us as citizens. Quote, others may continue to view politics or the economy as an arena for their own power plays. For our part, let us foster what is good and place ourselves at its service. All right, well, how exactly do we do that? It's a long story. There's 6 more chapters, in fact. I'm just going to share the chapter headings with you so you get a feel for the flow of his presentation. It's worth noting that 6 chapters are dedicated to where we go from here, and just the one dark chapter that I highlighted sets the stage, followed by the beautiful exegesis of the Good Samaritan. So the 6 chapter headings are envisaging and engendering an open world, a heart open to the whole world, a better kind of politics, dialogue and friendship in society, paths of renewed encounter, and religions at the service of fraternity in our world. I'd like to summarize the overall argument by briefly relating 3 of Francis's core concepts, leitmotifs that cut across and organize the chapters and were also central to his life and ministry. These are social friendship, the culture of encounter, and human fraternity. These are practices, not static ideas, ways forward in a divided world, and concrete reasons for hope. I'll briefly describe each and then illustrate them together in the specific case of the migration crisis. First, Francis calls for the cultivation of social friendship, a friendship that goes beyond family and friends to encompass those outside our comfortable circles. New technologies such as social media and mobile phones, as well as wider cultural forces of individualism and consumerism, are increasingly separating us into fearful and hostile camps. Of course, we naturally gravitate towards friends who share our interests and worldviews, but our feelings toward those outside our familiar circles have grown increasingly cold. We're more apt than ever to divide the world into friends on the one hand and what Francis calls associates, that is, practically everyone else, at work and even in our neighborhoods, who we increasingly see not as fellow human beings worthy of recognition and attention and care, but as distant outsiders to be engaged in a polite and businesslike way at best, but without any warmth or heartfelt respect. To rebuild our societies, Francis insists, we must learn to see the humanity and the vulnerability in everyone we meet. We should practice tenderness and kindness towards all. That's the core of social friendship. Now, it might be objected that we have nothing in common with the associates that surround us in our physical and virtual worlds, that we have different interests, that they may even pose threats to our livelihood and way of life. Is social friendship then an empty ideal? How do we get there? This is where the culture of encounter comes in, one of Francis's favorite ideas and practices, honed during his years as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, as shepherd of a sprawling megacity rife with divisions and conflict. The word encounter, which Francis mentions 49 times in Fratelli Tutti, has the idea of tension and conflict built into it. Its Latin root, contra, means opposition or against. To encounter someone for Francis is to be open to difference and to the inevitability of conflict, but still to reach out to try to find points of commonality and to build shared projects, to get to know one another, to build trust, to create a dynamic space where social friendship, even love, is possible, even love of enemies, one of Jesus' most difficult teachings. The building of cultures of encounter, respecting and working through conflict, not erasing it, is vital if we are to address our broken world. We should expect it of ourselves and even of our politicians, Francis insists. When he writes of political love in the encyclical, an entire chapter, as you heard, he's not calling for an end to hard-hitting political combat, but he is insisting at the very least on a renewed focus on the common good, not an abstract public interest, but the good of everyone, especially those on the margins, and on an end to the degradation and dehumanization of political opponents, a hatred that can easily descend into violence, as we can see in this country and the world around us. For Francis, the hard work of building social friendship through encounter is related to the practice of human fraternity across all kinds of communities, social, religious, and political, within and across nations. Fraternity for Francis is not simply an abstract ideal. We're not to love one another unquestioningly because we are children of the same God. Fraternity is not a command, it's a practice that comes about through repeated, respectful encounters that can build social friendship over time. A concrete example of this dynamic forms a backdrop for Fratelli Tutti, the friendship that gradually emerged between Francis and Grand Imam Al-Tayeb of the Al-Azhar Institute in Egypt, a prominent leader of the world's Sunni Muslim community. The two men met in Rome and Cairo, building a bond of trust that led to a joint declaration, the Document on Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together, that they signed in Abu Dhabi in 2019. One of the most striking things about Fratelli Tutti is how it incorporates large sections of the Document on Human Fraternity verbatim, including opposition to religious fundamentalism, violence, and infringements on religious freedom. This is the only encyclical in history which quotes so extensively from an interfaith document, effectively giving voice to a representative of another religious tradition. Talk about encounter. The relationship between Francis and Al-Tayeb, documented in Fratelli Tutti, is a concrete example of how social friendship, encounter, and human fraternity can unfold together and have an impact over time. Now, I said that Francis had contributed to the development of Catholic social thought at the outset. I think his analysis of the world today, the idea of the technocratic paradigm, basic threats to human dignity, and even the idea of the common good, that's part of his contribution, wielding the tradition, applying it to the current moment. But I also think on the positive side, there's a real contribution. And of the three central concepts in Fratelli Tutti, fraternity, social friendship, and culture of encounter, his ideas on encounter, I think, represent his most original and enduring, I hope, contribution. Historically, the Church has been ambivalent about the inevitability of conflict in social and political life. Before Vatican II in the 1960s, the opening of the Church to the modern world, popes tended to view society as an ordered whole in which citizens, equal in dignity before God, should inhabit defined positions in a stable hierarchy. For example, Leo XIII and Pius XI in the encyclicals that I've quoted rejected liberalism and socialism, some of the dominant ideologies of the day, not just for their materialism, but also for their emphasis on conflict, on market competition in the case of liberalism, and class conflict in the case of Marxism. In the key documents of the Second Vatican Council, the Church opened up to dialogue with the wider world, but retained a general optimism about the prospects for economic and social cooperation in an orderly fashion for the common good. John Paul II and Benedict XVI were less optimistic about dialogue and the state of the world, and emphasized the importance of sharing established church teaching confidently with an increasingly secular world. Francis's emphasis on encounter, I want to suggest, marks a new direction. He maintained his predecessor's focus on the centrality of the gospel and Christian witness to the world, while encouraging, in thought and action through his ministry, the generous and patient engagement with the other, inside as well as outside the church, as a way to address the divides, the inevitable divides that plague or characterize, if we want to be more value neutral, our political, social, and ecclesial life. Let me conclude, to leave some time for questions, by illustrating the themes of Fratelli Tutti around a particular topic of great significance at the time of this webinar, October 2025. The issue of migration, which figures extensively in Fratelli Tutti and is especially relevant today, given the Trump administration's deportation campaign, which is impacting millions of long-term law-abiding U.S. residents. Shortly before his death last April, Francis publicly criticized Trump's assault on the immigrant community, decrying, quote, the act of deporting people who in many cases have left their own land for reasons of extreme poverty, insecurity, exploitation, persecution, or serious deterioration of the environment. At the same time, and sometimes this is forgotten, Francis recognized the importance of, quote, a policy that regulates orderly and legal migration, unquote. Catholic social teaching up through Francis and Pope Leo acknowledges both the right of migrants to seek better lives in other countries and the right of countries to control their borders, even as it calls for generosity in welcoming and integrating migrants and refugees. In Fratelli Tutti, which includes the most extensive discussion of migration in any papal teaching since the 1950s, Francis recognized the deep social and political divisions that make progress on the migration issue so difficult in the United States and elsewhere. While he insisted that immigration is beneficial for a country, enriching its economic and cultural life, he did not downplay the sources of political opposition. I realize that some people are hesitant and fearful with regard to migrants, he wrote in Fratelli Tutti. I consider this part of our natural instinct of self-defense. Acknowledging the complexities and conflicts surrounding the migration issue, Francis also pointed a way forward through the patient building of a culture of encounter and the fostering of social friendship. Too often, Francis lamented in Fratelli Tutti, quote, migrants are not seen as entitled like others to participate in the life of society. It is forgotten that they possess the same intrinsic dignity as any person, unquote. Recognizing migrants as members of our communities and interacting with them in a spirit of mutual respect, Francis insists, can foster integration respectful of difference. In his first major statement on the issue this past July, Leo echoed Francis's call for recognition and even admiration of the migrants in our midst. In a world darkened by war and injustice, even when all seems lost, migrants and refugees stand as messengers of hope, he said. Their courage and tenacity bear heroic testimony to a faith that sees beyond what our eyes can see, unquote. Now, concluding with a migration example might give us pause as we think about Fratelli Tutti and its prescription for ways forward in a divided world. Encounter, friendship, and fraternity, those of us in the United States, and particularly here in Washington, D.C., so familiar with the heated rhetoric, with the hatred and cruelty that surrounds the migration issue. Can we imagine a more respectful debate that brings together justice and mercy, and that involves listening to and learning from migrants who contribute to our communities in so many ways? To come back to the skepticism I evoked at the beginning of this talk, isn't what Pope Francis calls the dream of human fraternity just a dream? Maybe we're better giving it up? Now, Francis has a rejoinder to that skepticism. In Fratelli Tutti and across his pontificate, whether the issue is migration, inequality, human rights, peace, or many others. Patience. The work of building human fraternity through social friendship and a culture of encounter requires patience. Patience in the sense of it takes time, but patience also in the sense of endurance. It's not going to be easy. Francis introduced the theme of patience in his first major statement as Pope, the 2013 Apostolic Exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. It's a beautiful document. I highly recommend it. There he devoted a whole section to the principle that, quote, time is greater than space. And here's how he explained it. This principle enables us to work slowly but surely without being obsessed with immediate results. It helps us patiently to endure difficult and adverse situations or inevitable changes in our plans, to give priority to actions which generate new processes in society and engage other persons and groups who can develop them to the point where they bear fruit in significant historical events. Without anxiety, but with clear convictions and tenacity, unquote. Realizing the vision of human fraternity set out in Fratelli Tutti, in even a partial and incremental way, will require time, energy, creativity, and patience. We can move toward the world that Francis sketches out for us. It's a world we recognize, a world that can and should be built, but that can only be constructed by initiating processes that can and will unfold over time. Fratelli Tutti itself, a living document, a young document, only 5 years old, will remain a source of inspiration for those of us who take up this work now and into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much, Tom, for a really engaging and I think a talk which has in itself been an encounter. I think that already some questions are coming in which actually ask, take on what you was just saying at the end about the encounter and about patience. Loretta Jordan, for example, says, how to love the current perpetrators of evil, discrimination and meanness. How do you do that? How can you do that? She asks.
Yeah, well, that's a perennial question. Incredibly difficult. That's one of the things I love about Pope Francis. He sets our sights high. He calls out the goal of human fraternity, but he recognizes the difficulty and our failings along the way. Jesus' call to love our enemies is, to say the very least, counterintuitive. And there's so many forces in our society pushing us in the other direction. For me, I always come back to this idea of social friendship, widening the circle, beginning at the local and personal level. It's the people we meet face to face. In Evangelii Gaudium, the beautiful document I mentioned towards the ends there, Francis has a warning for intellectuals saying, don't be up there in your ivory towers writing about how to make the world a better place and think that you've thereby made a real contribution or a full contribution. You've got to get out there, meet people, especially those you disagree with, patiently listen, try to find common ground. And that does mean engaging with people who've done evil things. But from a Christian point of view, anybody is redeemable. And it's only through the process of engagement and encounter that while we pursue justice, we can also pursue forgiveness and reconciliation, even with those who perpetrate evil. So that's a very general answer, but I hope I've given you something.
Thanks, Tom, for that. In a sense, you've answered the next question, but I'm still going to ask it because it's an important question. It's come from George Matholi. In the context of the deteriorating moral tenor of the world and the decline of the United States of America, once a champion of democracy, how do we spread hope?
Very interesting question. You mentioned, Mike, in the outset that I'm a political scientist by training. And there's an interesting premise in the question, decline of the United States. Certainly, U.S. influence is on the wane, other powers rising in a material sense, and certainly soft power of the United States, the ability of the United States to shape global debates around democracy and human rights is waning as we face our own crisis of democracy in this country. I mentioned here in passing that Pope Francis holds up international institutions as a cause for hope. But of course, as we saw at the recent UN General Assembly, the UN is in disarray. So it's a dark moment, but I would say on the positive side, the relative decline of the United States, and indeed of Europe, the old imperial core, if you go back hundreds of years, is an opportunity, especially for the global South, to assume greater responsibility, to be at the table at the UN and in other forums, to have a more inclusive global conversation about the future of the world. And I'll just mention in passing the project of the Georgetown Global Dialogues, which has been going for a couple of years. We have another convening coming up in Barcelona, precisely designed to bring together a truly global conversation with representation from the global South. So I think moving into a world where the United States needs to listen to and learn from others, to form alliances in support of human rights and democracy. It's a difficult time of transition, many instabilities, but it's also a hopeful moment if we can build a more inclusive global community and particularly bring in voices from the global South.
Thanks for that. When he's talking about hope, and you talk about hope quite well significantly throughout your talk, and because he does throughout the encyclical. When we go back to St. Paul, hope requires some support, faith, and charity. Does that come through in the encyclical, do you think?
Yeah, in a way, you can think of the encyclical, it's not explicit in there, but as a reflection on Paul's faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love, 1 Corinthians 13. Hope is something I stumble on. I thought it needed to be addressed at the beginning of the encyclical, because why write something like this, right? It's such a dark time. And Francis himself foregrounds it. What are the sources of hope? And Francis, to his credit, as I mentioned, is very clear that for him, as a believing Christian, the fact that there's a loving God, that God is in charge, means that things will work out at the end in some extended sense, that there's every reason for hope. But he's also very open to sources of hope in other traditions. I mentioned his dialogue with Al-Tayeb and the Muslim community. He had similar wonderful dialogues with the Jewish community, with non-Abrahamic religions, and also with the wider secular world. He loved to interact with artists of all kinds. He used to teach literature as part of his formation. He loved movies. He believed that sources of hope were present in human culture more widely, and that we need to draw on them as liberally as we can. There is an irrational moment to it. If you just look around the world with cold rationality, where are the sources of hope? But when you talk to people, especially young people who look forward to the future with hope and want to change the world for the better. There are real resources there. Um, so yeah, that's just a
Yeah.
little bit on hope. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Mary Gentili says, what signs of continuity do you see in the words and actions of Pope Leo XIV? Have you seen or heard references to social friendship or to cultural encounter? Is
Uh,
there a
yes,
continuity of message?
there's quite a bit of continuity. As we all remember, when Leo came out on the balcony, he immediately invoked Pope Francis and Francis's legacy. And indeed, if you look through his addresses, as I have, you find references, especially to encounter and culture of encounter. Just the other day, he mentioned it again. Um, it's a tool I think he's going to pick up and carry forward. Of course, uh, because he's been in office for a relatively short period of time, he hasn't had a chance to issue his own encyclicals, although in the coming days we expect an apostolic exhortation on the topic of love of the poor, which suggests, again, a high degree of continuity with Francis and his pontificate. I expect the elements of continuity to 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 be even more prominent. I haven't seen social friendship as a theme develop, but certainly fraternity on the one hand and culture of encounter are already part of his public discourse.
Um, yes, and Mary continues. And what about the rest of the Vatican leadership? Is there enough of a groundswell of leaders committed to encounter rather than self-defense to continue to pursue this path? Are
Yeah,
there going to be enough? Did he did he make enough cardinals?
yeah. Again, I'm not an expert. I'm not a Vaticanologist, but from my encounters in Rome and our various partnerships there, um, there's clearly been a shift when you're a pope for that long, for a dozen years, and make those appointments, bishops and cardinals. A culture shift can take place. The best evidence we have for it is the Synod on Synodality, which met over several years, including sessions in the fall of 23 and the fall of 24, very much in the spirit of encounter. Francis wanted to initiate processes of consultation, of listening, that went well beyond the hierarchy and brought cardinals and bishops together with lay people, experts, non-Christians around a table to think about the future direction of the church and the future direction of the world. Synodality, there'll be another big meeting in 2028 to carry this work forward. And Leo has already signaled, he did in his first addresses, the importance of synodality as a process. I didn't mention in my talk, but I could have. It is, if you like, the application of the idea of culture of encounter to church affairs and to some of the difficult issues that the church is addressing internally. Um, and under Francis, for the first time, it was possible to speak of all kinds of controversial issues, whether it's women in the priesthood or the church's prohibition on homosexuality and other topics, um, divorce, remarriage, and communion for Catholics. Francis introduced a beautiful distinction between the church's position on these issues, um, which is one thing and which changes slowly. It does change in some cases. Capital punishment had changed under his leadership, for example. Um, so you've got the church's position, but you can talk about it. You can say, this is where I think the church should go. I accept the teaching authority of the church, but let's have a conversation. That opening up of space within the church, and to your point, the involvement, the point of the question, the involvement of the new generation of bishops and cardinals in the process of those conversations gives me hope that this idea of encounter has been embedded within the culture of the church.
Interesting. Talk about women and the church. The Church of England seems to be a little bit ahead now with electing the first time a woman to be Archbishop of Canterbury after 800 years. And maybe Francis might have even seen one day in another 800 years there might be a female pope.
Well, he likes to talk about the future being open. So, you know,
Yeah.
so, but these are obviously very contested and
We
difficult
know,
issues. I mean, right now the issue is, can you have women deacons? So
yeah.
women popes is further down the line in terms of
Yeah. Yeah. I can remember in the Anglican Church had the women deacons. Actually, it's not so long ago that occurred. So I've seen that debate in England going on. And Mary again says, and among other faith traditions and cultures, who are the other leaders interested in pursuing this path?
Well, I mentioned Al-Tayeb, also in the Jewish community, Jewish leaders in the United States, Israel, and around the world have been engaged with the Vatican around Encounter. It's worth saying something maybe about interfaith dialogue as a movement altogether. Of course, it's existed in small communities since time immemorial, but formal interfaith dialogue really started. There were touches of it at the end of the 19th century in that first era of globalization, religious leaders coming together. It was when the Catholic Church embraced interfaith dialogue and recognized that God's light and love can shine through in other traditions at the Second Vatican Council that a formal process began to take shape. John Paul II famously invited religious leaders to Assisi in 1986. There have been other movements that have emerged, everything from the Parliament of the World's Religions, which met in 1893 and got restarted in our current era of globalization in 1993, to the IF20, an interfaith organization that the Berkeley Center supports that accompanies the work of the G20 and tries to bring religious voices into global debates. I think this is often overlooked. It's become a trope to think that religious conflict is the rule and religious extremism and fundamentalisms in conflict are the source of division. But what we've seen since the 1960s, I think overall, has been a very positive development, even if its impact at the level of the G20 or in resolving wars in the Middle East, Ukraine, or elsewhere is very modest. This idea of encounter, this idea of human fraternity has become, I would say, an object of consensus across the world's major religious traditions.
Thanks for that. Sorry, my computer was just about to go off. I hope it doesn't. But thanks for that. How can we bring, says Carol Kinzer, how can we bring Pope Francis's message of Laudate Si and Fratelli Tutti to our US priests who, with bishops and priests, do not always uplift Pope Francis's message to heal the common home and others?
Yeah.
And another one, Jane McCullough asks the same things. How do we take this through for the American bishops to understand it? Will they begin to speak with a more united voice against the current migrants and the cruelty that is being laid out to the migrants through the United States, basically?
Yeah. I mean, I see it happening. I think many of us last weekend here in DC were at a mass to celebrate migrants, at which Cardinal McElroy, Archbishop Cardinal here, gave an amazing speech calling out the current administration, using strong language to condemn this aggressive deportation campaign. So when you've got cardinals in powerful positions speaking out, I think that's a good signal. We haven't always had that. Um, like many who care about this issue specifically, but also Pope Francis's legacy more broadly, and are concerned about more about resistance to that message of social friendship and encounter, within the American church. I mean, let's let it sink in. We have an American Pope. Now, I know he spent a lot of time in Latin America, and he's a citizen of the world, but over time, Pope Leo will, I'm confident, have a very positive impact on the political discourse in this country, on the church in this country, very much in the direction that I tried to lay out in my talk, in the direction of encounter and openness and dialogue with those we disagree with. I think that's the only way forward.
Fine, thank you. I think we're going to have to bring this to a close. I see Susan Maloney has another question about that she's very disappointed that he doesn't address the particular sufferings of women and the church's teachings on women. But I think that is
Well,
there.
I will say something about it, and that was a very legitimate critique of Fratelli Tutti. There's, in fact, only a small, short passage on women. So the document doesn't have everything, and you really have to read it together with the rest of Pope Francis's teaching over the course of his pontificate, where there are greater moments of hope and engagement with that key question.